This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
So there's other things that are very beneficial here as well too, which I think are important, which are part of doula work, and that is helping all of community and society get far more comfortable about talking about death and dying, and educating all of us on how we support others in grief, right? Not just about how can I support myself now that I'm in grief, but if my friend loses a sibling or my friend loses a child, how can I support my friend? We don't do this enough.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Get ready for a wonderful conversation with end-of-life doula Karen Hendrickson of Death Doula Network International. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode of The Heart of Hospice is sponsored by Odonata Care. When caring for a loved one on hospice, support becomes essential. Introducing the Care Plan, a path to comfort for the hospice patient, a supportive guide by experienced hospice nurses Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire. Nancy and Brenda invite you to experience all that the Care Plan has to offer. Be sure to check out their free library of care videos on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net.
This interview blew me away. I cannot remember the last time I heard a story or had a conversation with a colleague on the podcast that was so moving. My friend, my colleague, Karen Hendrickson is my guest today. Karen is a death doula. She's an educator. She specializes in end-of-life planning, and she is an education specialist as well. She's a public speaker and a licensed Willow EOL educator and a grief support specialist. This lady does it all, everything related to grief and death and dying. She's also the co-founder of Death Doula Network International. She's doing some fabulous work. She's based in Canada. This is Karen's second time on the podcast, and she's here to talk with me today about a very specific topic. We're talking about sibling loss because it's an overlooked thing. Grief support, grief resources for teenagers, younger people who have lost siblings. So Karen's going to tell you the story of losing her brother when she was 17, about his death in a house fire, and how that event affected her and her entire family, how their family dynamics changed when her brother died. She's going to talk about the ways it affected her life, even up much past her teenage years into her 30s, and how the family dynamics and the way things were handled with her brother's death changed the way her grief experience moved and flowed. We're going to be talking about how to support teenagers who are experiencing grief, how to support young people, and how to keep them from feeling invisible, this unseen loss. I will tell you, it is a very moving story. It's very deep, and sometimes it gets very heavy. So I would ask you, if you're listening and you begin to get deeply into the story when Karen's describing what's happened, I would tell you to pause the podcast for just a second and take a deep breath and put your hand on your chest over your heart space and press gently back just so that you can feel your heartbeat. And then take a deep breath and remember that this is an experience that Karen lived, but it's in the past. and she is moving forward, and so are you. And then restart the podcast and listen. It's a moving story, and it's an important story. So here's my conversation with Karen Hendrickson. Karen, it's so wonderful to talk with you today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Helen. I'm so glad to be here.
This is our second conversation. I've managed to snag you back to have a solo interview, and it's so much fun. It's like having an old friend and reconnecting.
Yeah, so lovely to be with you today again, too, for sure. Yeah.
So even though we know each other and my audience knows you some, I figured we'd open with an icebreaker question that I didn't give you, so it's going to be a surprise. So here's your question. If you were ruler of the world, who would be your top advisor?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know, I really like that one.
That's a really big question. Oh. Years ago, I would have said Oprah Winfrey, but I wouldn't say that today. Today, I think really it's, oh my Lord, there's so many good people who could be advisors for you, on so many different levels. Breen Brown is one. Dalai Lama is another. So many. I can't pick. I can't pick.
Well, those are pretty good ones right there. Brene Brown and the Dalai Lama. You can't go wrong either way.
I would hope not.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. I know I kind of would like to answer that question for myself, but it takes some thought, doesn't it?
Yeah, you would really have to think about what is it most that you would want insight from, right? And, those two in particular, I think, really drive from this place of, even as the ruler of the world, integrity, authenticity, kindness, right? Embracing our humanness, those things that our world is so challenged with right now.
Yes. I have to say that there's a little part of me that when I first read that question and I thought about it for myself, I was thinking sort of like Gru and the Minions, who would be my go-to number one advisor if I was a villain and ruler of the world,
Right.
Yeah, it went to a dark place for just a minute there. So we know you value authenticity and transparency and honesty, and that's the conversation that we're having today, is all about those things as related to some personal experience you've had. And we're talking about sibling loss today, which is something we haven't really focused on the podcast before. And I think it's an important topic. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. But let's start with the basics. You are an end-of-life doula. So tell me briefly about the work that you're doing as an end-of-life doula and your organization, Death Doula Network International.
Sure. So as an end-of-life doula, I support individuals and families in the process of just about every facet there is related to end of life, or even just advanced care planning. So some of these individuals are with terminal illness, and some of these individuals are just wanting to plan and prepare. So some of it is about doing medical directives, identifying healthcare representatives, putting plans in place. In other cases, it's about actively supporting individuals in this journey on end of life. And that's holding space. It's creating opportunity for individuals to have some of the tough conversations with their people that oftentimes are too uncomfortable to have without some guidance and some support. It's about helping people to come to terms with the life that they've lived and acknowledging their value and what they've given to the world and being here prior to their death. It can be a lot of that. With respect to the Death Doula Network International, I'm a co-founder of that organization, and our intention with that organization is to essentially open up the container to build community within the death caring arena. And so our network is called Death Doula Network International, but we actually have members who do other things within the death caring field. So we have funeral directors, we have celebrants, we have individuals who provide palliative massage or other forms of, naturopathic modalities or those types of things. And our intention here is is to build communities so that we can recognize, A, in this work, we are not alone, and B, there's a number of resources and perspectives of individuals all over the world that can help us in relation to doing this work effectively and staying whole to ourselves in alignment with our values and our beliefs, and drawing on the expertise of others when we need it, because we will never have all of the answers. And yet death is universal. Yes, we have different legalities. Yes, we have different forms, and we have different processes and different healthcare systems, but death is universal. And so we've had the opportunity to create this community. We have approximately 250 active members in a number of countries now. And we're excited for the work that's happening there and how community is being built with individuals inside our community to do this work more effectively and to really level up and increase the voice in community at large about the importance of talking about death and dying and trying to do it differently, which is something both myself and my partner, Joanne Hahn, are extremely passionate, and that's about changing our conversations and changing the way we do death.
Yeah, absolutely. A wonderful organization. Such a valuable recognition that it takes all our skills and all our gifts to combine together to provide the robust care that people need when it comes to death and dying. And that's one of the aspects that we are talking about today, because we're talking about grief.
We are.
Which is always involved. Grief doesn't just happen when the death occurs. Grief starts long before that, and it can last a lifetime. It does last a lifetime. So we wanted to focus today on a very specific aspect of grief and loss, the loss of a sibling. You lost your brother very suddenly when you were a teenager, and he was only 22. Will you share that story with me?
Sure. So it was February 25th, 1979, a day like any other day. For the most part, we thought it was going to be anyways, I guess. And, prior to this date, my family was a typical Canadian family. And my dad was a blue collar worker. My mom worked. There were 3 siblings, myself and 2 older brothers. And, we were almost the Beaver Cleavers, from the Leave It to Beaver story in relation to what our life looked like. And around 5 a.m. on the morning of February 25th, 1975, or 1979, pardon me, the doorbell rang. And of course, we were asleep in our beds, those of us that were at home there. And I remember standing at the top of the stairs in my pink fluffy robe, and my mom answered the door, and there stood 2 policemen. And they asked a couple of questions, is this where Ernest Gordon Turner lives? And my mom says, yes. And my mom says, that's my son. And they asked if my dad was home. And my mom said, yes. And I was ushered to go get my dad and get my dad. We're sitting in our living room. My dad in the rocking chair he always sat in, the usual chair, my mom in her usual spot on the couch, and me in my usual spot on the couch, except it was an extremely unusual event. And these 2 police officers sat on the hearth of our fireplace and told my parents that my brother had died in a house fire. And they talked about the fact that there was a house fire, there was one deceased. They believed it to be my brother, and that my dad would need to go to the hospital to identify him in the morgue there. And so my dad got ready, drove to the hospital, and my mom and I sat in the living room looking out the window for hours, it felt like, right? Both of us still in our robes, waiting until my dad came back home. And the whole time my mom kept saying, Ernie always lost his wallet. Maybe somebody had his wallet. Ernie always lost his wallet, praying that it wasn't him. And my dad pulled into the driveway in his truck, and he put his arms up on the steering wheel, and he bowed his head, and he was sobbing so much that you could physically see the shaking through the windows. And so we knew it was my brother. My dad came into the house and he stood up at the top. Like, we had a bi-level home. He comes up the stairs. He's standing at the top of the stairs and he can barely speak. And he says, it was him. And all I'll remember is the black body bag. And then he sat down beside me and talked about how much he loved us and how it was so wrong that this had happened and how he should have been the one who died, not my brother, and inconsolable. And then he walked down the hall into his room, and my mom walked down the hall after him. And that was the beginning of us tucking our grief into the shadows. And so then, the typical things occur. Eventually, people get called. Some family shows up. And as a sibling, these are some of the things that you hear. You need to look after your mom and dad. You need to be strong now. And then along the way, this turned into things. Karen, don't make trouble. Right? Remember your mom and dad. Look after your mom and dad. At the time that all of this was happening, actually, my other brother wasn't even home. He had been out for the night. And so, throughout, in the course of that first day, he shows up and gets the news as well. But so as a surviving sibling now, what happens is you've lost a sibling, but you've lost your whole family. Everything has changed, and every one of you has changed in the moment of that loss. My parents, our parents, were never the same. We were never the same. And you realize that there's now this void in the family that you now feel responsible for filling. And so at 16 years of age, how do you fill the gap of the fact that your parents have lost a child and that your brother's not a part of the family? And so you move into this place of very quickly, in our situation, we never talked about the grief. We never shared about our feelings. In the course of that week or so, when arrangements were made, I wasn't actively involved in any of the planning of cremation or funeral arrangements, but I was asked to go down to the Bay, which was a local department store, with my uncle, and to buy a pair of black Levi jeans and a shirt so that my brother had something to wear when he was cremated. At 16. At the time, I remember it like, jeans are jeans, right? Black jeans are black jeans, and Levi's Levi. But I felt like it was the hardest decision I could ever make about which ones were the right ones. There was like 2 options, not a big deal really, but it was big work for me. But it was the only thing I was involved in the process of that. The funeral was held at a local funeral home, not a mile away from where we lived. Some stranger stood up and talked about my brother. And our family was in a separate room from those who attended. And even at that age, I knew it wasn't the way we should be doing it. It wasn't the way this should be. Not just the fact that my brother died, but that we weren't talking about it. My parents cried in their rooms. I would go up to the park with our dog and sit on the swing for hours at a time, sobbing, because I was alone. Because I'd lost my brother, but also because I was alone. And to this day, I really have no idea what my other brother, Gary, did with his grief or how he coped with that, right? And so, time goes on. We had one picture hanging up in our dining room of my brother, Ernie, for 34 years, for the next 34 years that my family owned that home. One picture. There was never conversations about memories, about joyous times. If his name got brought up, my dad left the room. My mom, probably about 15 years after he died, started putting together a photo album and a memory book that was just about my brother Ernie. And it was in the back room where her crafts were that she was doing. And my dad walked in there one time to talk to her about something while she was in it. And he told her he could never look at that book. And so I got angry. Right? I was angry through this as well, too, because I had a brother. Our family looked different. Nobody ever asked, how are you doing? I was off for a week. I go back to school. I had one friend who phoned me up and said, Karen, would you like me and Jim to drive you to school on Monday? And Jim was her boyfriend. And I said, oh, that would be lovely. Thank you. And they drove me to school. I was in grade 11. And I didn't know this at the time. I learned years and years later, but Jim's brother had actually attended the fire. Jim's brother had gone to school with my brother, Ernie, and he was a new firefighter, and he was actually at the scene. But I didn't know that at the time. And yet on that drive to school, nobody talked about anything. But they'd given me a ride. That was the most that anybody showed up for me as a young teenager navigating this grief. I had 4 classes that I took at that time. Not one teacher asked me how I was. Nobody said, Karen, I'm sorry to hear about your brother. Not one administrator, not one counselor. Nobody checked in with me. And my friends, for the most part, apart from very few, all disappeared. Now, the good thing is things are a little bit different today for youth in grief. There are some resources and some services. But, at that time, I was alone. We were alone, right? We still had a family of 4. We had been a family of 5. We were now a family of 4, and every single one of us was alone in our grief because my parents didn't have the tools, resources, and support to help them. How could they help us? When I think about it now, at my age now of 60, and I look back, I think, good gosh, my mom took a week off work. A week off work. Her son died. And then went back to work. And this was like barely a year and a half after her dad died, and a year following, her mom died. So in the course of 3.5 years, my mom lost 3 really important people. Right? My dad the same, right? Back to work. Don't talk about it. Don't share. Don't be together in your pain and your memory. There's good memory, right? We lost that. We lost the good memory, the opportunity to share that.
Karen, there's so much to look at when it comes to all the different facets of your story, which I think is probably a story that so many other people experience when they have the loss of a young person, a sibling in their family. Mm. It changed the structure of your family. It broke it apart into little pieces that didn't quite glue back together again because they didn't have the support that they needed.
Yeah.
If you could choose, or if you had to choose 5 words to describe the grief you experienced as a teenager, what 5 words would you choose?
Lonely, unimaginable, paralyzing, could be debilitating. How many is that?
4.
4, yeah. Heartbreaking. And I even use a 6, right? And that is that, on some level, it's forever.
Yeah. The loss is forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as a sibling, the important piece for me in this story today is recognizing that for the siblings and the surviving children where this occurs in family, there's so much other things that become at risk or at stake for those children. in our circumstance, in our situation, when you take on when you take on the words that adults are saying to you, look after your parents. There's something wrong with that ask, in my opinion, right?
It's an incredible burden.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And don't make trouble.
Don't make trouble.
So don't complain, don't criticize, don't speak out, don't talk back, don't contradict.
Mm-hmm. And so it created some pain for us as a family going forward, right? So, my brother Gary and I dealt with this very, very differently. Our home wasn't a really robust, loud home to begin with prior to my brother Ernie's death, but afterwards it was a silent home. One that for me, myself, I couldn't get out of soon enough because it was so silent. And as a result, I made some poor choices about how I did that. They weren't the best choices for me. And then, I think Gary and I both for a long time, and probably in some respects, maybe on some levels still for the long time, there was this need or this sense of never feeling like he would be enough. I mean, and oftentimes kids feel that anyways, but we felt it even more. How could we ever be enough? Because we could never fill the void. And yet we had adults telling us in ways that we should try to make up for that loss. Yes. Well, you can't. You can't. My mom today is 88 years old. We will never, ever be able to fill the void with respect to the fact that her son died.
Yeah.
Way too young.
You're 2 where you were always supposed to be 3.
Right. Yeah. So, and these put, these kinds of pressures, depending on that youth or that teenager, can really absolutely impact the trajectory of their lives in not good ways, For me, I became an overachiever. Right? I became one of those that was driven to perfection and doing best, and everything was about proving myself. And no matter what I achieved, it wasn't enough. I needed to prove myself some more, right? And I became rebellious. For years, my mom and I in no way really ever got along because I just rebelled against everything, and now at 61 years of age, I can easily look back at it all and say, my mom moved to this place of absolute fear and protection. She didn't want to lose another child. So it became really restrictive and tight and uncomfortable for me. And it created a lot of grief between the two of us in our relationship. Because as a youth and as a young adult, I couldn't appreciate that it was about protection, right, and fear.
Did you recognize as a young person that was her motivation behind her fear and her wanting to be so restrictive and protective, that it had everything to do with the loss of your brother and not really so much to do with you? Could you see that as a young person?
As a young person, I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
I couldn't see it. And yet on the flip side of that, there was an element of me that as a result of my brother's death, I so very much wanted to live. And I felt like she was wanting to stifle that, not appreciating where that was coming from for her, right? Because we could never have open conversations. We didn't have the capacity to have open conversations about what had occurred for us in my brother's death and what this meant for us. So my mom could never say to me, Karen, look, right? I know it's hard for you to appreciate, but because Ernie's died, I really am scared now because I know a child can die now, right? Quite honestly, my mom and I did not have forthright conversations about my brother's death until my mom was like 85. My mom was 85 before I even knew that my mom went to the cemetery where my brother's ashes are interred.
So she waited all those years?
Yeah.
In between his death and when she was in her 80s?
Yeah. And that was, and what I believe, had triggered that was she was in the beginnings of dementia and she knew her life was coming to a close. And so she was starting to do some reflection and all of the things that we do. And so we began to have some conversations about that time and about him. I never knew. Our family never, ever went to where my brother's ashes are interred together, ever. We never talked about it. We never went. Just, my dad did not engage in any conversations with me about that time, or my brother's death, or my brother, until my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer. And then in the last 6 months of my dad's life, right, the lid got lifted and we had so much conversation. And I was so grateful for it all. He taught me so much in this process in the last months of his life, and being brave enough to have these conversations with me. And so at the time I was so grateful, but also really sad. My dad died in 2010. My brother Ernie died in 1979. A lot of wasted time. It could have been different for us, but grateful that in the last 6 months of his life, he had the knowing, right? And the desire more than anything, right? To have these conversations with me. It was the greatest gift of my dad's dying, quite honestly. Throughout all of this, my dad and I did have a good relationship. So don't misunderstand that. My dad and I had a good relationship. My mom and I, not so much, but my dad and I did. But it was an area we never, ever went to. We never stepped into those conversations. It was sort of an understanding, right? And so we didn't.
Well, it sounds like he guarded it pretty closely.
Mm-hmm.
When your dad realized that he had a terminal prognosis with the lung cancer, who brought up your brother? Did he bring it up? He wanted to talk about your brother?
My dad did, yeah.
Did he talk about the good memories, or did he talk about the trauma of your brother's death? Because make no mistake, the loss itself is traumatic, but the fact that your dad had to go and identify your brother's body, that's an added layer of trauma that even your mother didn't experience.
Right.
So what did he want to talk about with you?
It originally came from this place of wanting to ensure that both myself and Gary were very clear about the fact that he cared deeply about us, right? And he did have regret. He had regret about not being able to share. He had regret about his relationship with Ernie. There had been some troubling times with Ernie in the home prior to, and he was no longer living at our place, right? He was renting a place in another community, and this house actually that burnt down was a place his buddy was renting where he happened to be staying the night. So it wasn't even his own home. There was all kinds of stuff within this story that make it a bit messy. And my dad and him had some struggles, not really nasty, ugly struggles, but there had been struggles. So my dad had a lot of regret. And, so when I think about it right now today, that probably was the piece for him and his reflection on things, right? My dad also, and I've shared this part of my dad's story from other perspectives, but, my dad, was an atheist, and he really believed in nothing. When you die, that's the end of it. And yet, in the end, when my dad was dying in his final hours, when he was on the palliative ward in the hospital, he very lucidly said to me, "I can't wait to get up the hill and see Ernie. He's there waiting for me. I so want to talk to him. I have so much to say."
So had his belief in some sort of afterlife or after space changed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In those 6 months, it changed.
The Care Plan by Odonata Care has revolutionized the hospice experience by improving the standard of care. This booklet provides education and support to the patient and the patient's caregiver. The Care Plan provides step-by-step directions for caregiving tasks like cleaning or turning a patient. Hospice agencies utilize the Care Plan to support caregivers and to provide critical information in the moment when it's needed. This helps reduce after-hours calls and gives hospice staff more time for patient care. The Care Plan's simple design empowers caregivers by giving them the tools they need to feel confident caring for their loved one. Odonata founders Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire also offer a free library of care videos to provide even more support for caregivers. Videos can be found on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. The Care Plan is available in English or Spanish and can be purchased on the Odonata website at thecareplan.net. It's available in paper and digital formats, and bulk purchases are also available for agencies. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net.
Grief resources for teenagers and younger kids, we know they're out there. They're more than there used to be, but we know we don't give them the type of support that they need as often as they need it. Why do you think that happens? We know grief affects everybody in the family, regardless of age or stage. Why do you think we are so lax when it comes to supporting teenagers and younger kids who are siblings and they've had a loss?
I'm not sure what the whole answer is, but part of it, I think, is because we naturally go to what we believe to be the most devastating loss someone can experience. Our society as a whole, I believe, feels that the most devastating loss is the loss of a child.
Yes.
And so that's, what's worse than that? And so siblings become a little bit invisible. Secondary. We focus on how do you support the parent? How do you and even that, I'm thankful that there are so many resources that there are today with respect to parents and the loss of children, right? My experience from what I knew at the time was my parents had none. So it's where are the resources? How do you provide the resources to these young people? And then how do you do it in ways so that they get what they need, but even more importantly, their family and circle of adults, because we all have some, right? That circle of adults isn't out of focus and kindness for the parents, putting undue burden on the children. I like to think I turned out okay in the midst of all of this, right? But, I could have very easily turned to alcohol or substance abuse. I could have very easily be in a place today, where as a result of all of that, never found a way to own my self-worth and my value and hold confidence in this world and this life that I live, right? That could easily have been the outcome here.
We forget sometimes that while grief is universal, that it is individual. And we think of that, at least in my experience, in adult terms. What does an adult-sized griever need? But when in truth, it's much more individualized than that. What does a teenage griever need that's lost a sibling? And that whole pecking order thing about loss, it's absolutely true. Absolutely true. You can go to a Hallmark store and you're going to find something for somebody who's lost a child, somebody who's lost a spouse, somebody who's lost a parent. I don't know that I've ever seen a greeting card that says, "I'm sorry about the death of your brother."
And then when we know what naturally happens when there's loss, so this happens to adults, right? You lose a partner, right, to illness. So now you're a widow, and guaranteed some of your friends will disappear.
Right.
And they will disappear because they do not know how to navigate you in your grief.
Right.
So now let's roll that to a teenager, right? Who already, as a teenager, is trying to find self-identity, belonging, worthiness, right?
Yeah.
Now I've lost a sibling. Guaranteed, whatever community of friendships or supports that they have, some of those people will disappear.
And so I wonder if a teenager immediately processes, somehow I'm not worthy, somehow I'm weird, I don't deserve friends, that's why they're deserting me. Because teenagers, historically, they typically struggle with self-worth, so it would make sense that they take on the responsibility for that circumstance, to lose a circle of friends, on themselves.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the antidote. Let's lift this up a little bit. Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath from this. How can we as end-of-life workers, you as a doula, me as a hospice nurse, and all of my listeners who work in end-of-life care, in the dying space and the death space, how can we support teenagers who are experiencing loss like this?
It's being present, it's holding space, it's acknowledging, it's allowing them the support and the resources that they need to find their way in the circumstance. And it's supporting them in ways that leads them to a place where they can confidently believe that A, what occurred was not their fault, and B, that they are not responsible for taking care of mom and or dad or even other siblings. That we can be in this together. It's about the shared experiences. It's about connecting them with others who have shared experience of sibling loss. It's about allowing them the opportunities with the resources and the supports to have the conversations that are necessary, the conversations that put you in a playground at the local park on the swing, screaming your lungs out that says, I can't effing believe this happened to us. What happened? Right? That gives them the room and the space to be able to talk about the loneliness, the grief, the sadness, the fear of what's next, all of these things, right? And it's about leaving some room so that that support is not prescriptive either, because we know as adults, we know grief is individual, and what works for me doesn't work for you, right? So, this 1 to 10 things to do for a teenager that's grieving the sibling loss isn't necessarily all the right things for that individual. We don't have, certainly in our country here in Canada, in my communities here, we don't have enough resources in schools. We don't have enough resources in community to support these individuals, these young kids, we don't. There isn't enough. And it's all reactive. It's not proactive. So there's other things that are very beneficial here as well, too, which I think are important, which are part of doula work. And that is helping all of community and society get far more comfortable about talking about death and dying, and educating all of us on how we support others in grief, right? Not just about how can I support myself now that I'm in grief, but if my friend loses a sibling or my friend loses a child, how can I support my friend? We don't do this enough. It's all reactionary. It's not enough of it is proactive in knowledge and preparation. Comfort and conversations around death and dying and loss, if we were all more comfortable with that, our kids would be better.
Yeah.
My family would have been way better at the time.
Yeah. Your parents would have created a different model for you, a different support system for you, and you would have moved forward with your grief in a different way, maybe made different life choices. I'm not saying they were bad life choices, but you said yourself you could have made better choices.
Yeah, for sure, right? So if we can help to create some normalcy around this very issue that is an absolute part of life. We read about death every day. We hear about it on the news every day. Tragic death happens every day. Natural death happens every day. Death as a result of illness happens every day. if we can normalize the conversations around that, if we can be open about these experiences with our young people, then they'll be better equipped to face any kind of loss, because we'll be better equipped to also support them in it.
And won't they be better equipped to model that for their kids?
Exactly, right? And each other,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, when I think of some of my lived experiences with my brother's loss, the loss of my brother in particular, and how certain people disappeared, or how, as soon as you might be somewhere and somebody asked about Ernie or how things were going, how it's sort of like oil and water, you sort of would see the drop, and then it would separate, and that's what happens in crowds, separate.
Yeah.
But if people came together and just, could just listen instead of just telling you to suck it up and move on, they're like, life moves on. Yeah. But, grief stays with you forever, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's been over 40 years now. My life has been a really good, fabulous life, but I can still cry when I think about it.
Karen, when your mom wants to talk about Ernie, what does she want to talk about with you?
Well, my mom is in dementia now, right? And so what I did have the opportunity of was a couple of years where when she was starting to share and there was good lucidity still, she would actually talk very much about the relationship she had with him. He was the oldest of the three of us, and they were quite close in ways that I didn't appreciate when I was younger, that I didn't recognize when I was younger. And, so she would share with me about some of the things that they would talk about. And she used to drive him on Saturdays. He worked at a mill as a cleanup crew. And my mom would drive him from Surrey to Burnaby, which was about, a 30-minute drive in the car. And she would talk about how nice it was to have this time with him, right? And the way they would connect. And then she also would talk a little bit about how, and I think all parents probably carry this, no matter the circumstances of death of a child, but talked about how maybe if she had done some things differently, all of that stuff, right? If she had done things differently, maybe he wouldn't have, decided to move out of the house. Maybe he wouldn't have been there. Maybe, all those things, right? A little bit of that. And then as the dementia started to creep in, there was a situation for us. This was earlier this year where she was still living independently at the time, and we were going through some of her drawers, actually looking for her wedding rings, which she said she couldn't find. And she pulled a small blue box out of the drawer, and it was like a 3-inch square blue box that came from Sears, like 100. Sears isn't here anymore, but It was like this box. And she held it in her hands. She just pulled it out and she held it in her hand, cupped it in her hands. And she said to me, "This is so special." And I was like, "Oh, really, Mom? What is that?" I had never seen it before, right? I said, "Oh, what is it?" And she lifted up the lid, and inside was this round button like a badge that you would wear. And it said, "I'm the greatest." And then she pulled up the badge, and there was a little sort of like white abalone shell pocket knife. And as soon as I saw the knife, I knew it was my brother's. And she said to me, "This is my son's. This is my son's, who couldn't stay with us for very long." And I said, "Oh, really, Mom? You mean that's Ernie's?" And she looked at me in that moment, not knowing who I was or knowing that I knew Ernie, and said, "Oh, no, it was my son's." I said, "Yeah, Mom, my brother. Ernie was my brother." She said, "No, he wasn't. He was just my son." Since then, my mom many times does know who I am, right? In her dementia now, she has a photo album at the care home there that she looks through. We have pictures in there of him when he was a child, as well as the last picture that hung on our dining room wall. And she'll come to a few of the smaller pictures of when he was quite young, a toddler. And she'll say, "This is Ernie."
I've never had to stop an interview before. Let's just pause for just a second.
And so can I talk to that a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So for me, this is what part of what I find in the saddest part of dementia is that eventually she won't even know who he was. She won't know who any of us are at any point. And so I'm her, sometimes I'm her mom, sometimes I'm her sister. Occasionally she say, "Oh, here's my daughter, Karen." But dementia robs us of the life we lived, which is a whole nother topic.
Definitely. Karen, do you think that your mother's ability to open up, it's like some of her inhibitions have changed? And we know that about dementia and Alzheimer's, right? Because a lot of people lose their inhibitions and they talk about things or say things that they would never have said before. They lose modesty, that kind of thing. And it doesn't happen with everybody that has Alzheimer's dementia, but do you think that your mother's disease process has actually removed some of the barriers she had to talking about your brother?
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe the memory loss has taken away some of the memory of the actual death and how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit easier for her to talk about it.
Yeah, I do kind of believe, Helen, that in fact she's forgotten how he died. So my mom, this is not directly related to this, but my mom was the oldest of 6 siblings. All of her siblings have died too. Her husband's died. Sometimes she knows my brother Gary is her son. Sometimes she thinks he works there. And so I think when it comes to my brother Ernie now, she knows he was her son, but she doesn't remember the pain. And so for today, that's kind of good, right?
Yeah. You take the small blessings where you find them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Karen, you have a book that you are writing or have written about sibling loss, your experiences and everything you learned. Tell me about the book.
So I was compelled to write this book because I believe, first off, that my story is worthy of being told, and our stories help inform others. I think that that's an important piece, not just my story, but when I think of the many stories that I've heard and read in my life, that they are informative and can help us to change perspective. This particular story is extremely important to me because I know that even though things are significantly better than they were 40 odd years ago in 1979 when my brother Ernie died, we still don't have enough of the right supports, perspectives, and things available for youth and other children who lose siblings in their support. And I firmly believe they're still unseen. And so, my book shares about my story, but it also shares perspectives and research and insights in relation to what happens to siblings in this process. I like to believe that I was fortunate enough to, in some respects, the positive that came out of me for this was that, on those days when I was in the park sitting on the swing feeling so alone, and then going back to school and feeling so alone, I embodied this belief in myself that whatever I needed and whatever I wanted to do in my life, I would have to do alone. And so I had to find ways to rely on myself. And I believe that has helped me to become who I am. It has also made me obstinate and I like to say assertive. Some people sometimes would say aggressive. But bullish sometimes, maybe to some respect. I like to think diplomatically so, but, you know, the only person that ultimately I felt I could rely on was myself. And so that embodied a way that I approach my life. I like to believe that I've matured in the ways that I do that now, as opposed to when I was 20 something and 30 something. But it was, this is a good for me. For me, this is a part that turned out good for me because it gave me that resilience and that tenacity, and not looking to others to provide and support and to do the things that I needed, that if I wanted them, I needed to do them. Sometimes it's stubborn, and sometimes, I'm learning now at this stage at 61 years of age, I am now learning because of other life circumstances how to ask for help, right? A little sooner than I would have when I was 20 something. Yeah.
Well, it's a very necessary book and a very needed book, and your story needs to be told. People can learn, people can lean into it. I think it's very valuable. Tell my listeners when the book's coming out, how they can buy it, and how they can connect with you and the work that you're doing with Joanne Hahn at DD&I.
Mhm. So the book will be available early next year, probably second quarter next year it'll be available, and it'll be The Unseen Sorrow, Sibling Loss. And I haven't got all of my details prepared yet with respect to how it will be available at that time, but if you follow me on karenhendrickson.ca, you'll get all of the news as it's all coming together. Death Doula Network International, you can find us at ddnint.com, and we always welcome anyone and everyone to step in and join us on a monthly Dishing with the Doula session to learn what we're about and just engage in this conversation around one of the most important elements of our lives and one of the greatest teachers for all of us, and that is death and dying.
Well, if you haven't had a chance to see these ladies together, partnered in their outrageous, audacious selves, you don't want to miss it. You absolutely don't want to miss it. You guys are doing some fantastic work. Karen, thank you so much for sharing your story and your heart, and you certainly touched mine today. I can't remember the last time I cried so much during an interview, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen, for the opportunity to share and to be a part of this lovely work that you do here at the Heart of Hospice.
You can connect with Karen and the work she's doing at Death Doula Network International at ddnint.com. You'll find a link to Karen's story there, and you'll find a way to connect with Karen's personal website. Thank you for listening to this. I hope it was meaningful for you and that it resonated somehow for you. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.